Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to our first panel discussion on electricity in India. We have an exciting panel for you today. First up, we have Mr. Sagar Dhara, a scientist based in Hyderabad and a member of SAPAC, South Asian People's Action on Climate Crisis. A former air pollution expert and consultant to the UN, Mr. Dhara has amassed a great deal of expertise in the energetics field. He's authored books and is regularly published by media outlets like First Post, Ecologize, and Down to Earth, to name a few.
During his talk, Mr. Sagar Dhara said, leave the remaining fossil fuels in the ground. A major chunk of scientists agree with this. Earlier in the morning, he also mentioned 3 tipping points: climate change, the end of fossil fuels, and galloping inequality. So climate change pretty much causes the inequality or exacerbates it. But what this means is our inability to generate electricity or transport ourselves or goods will pretty much bring our civilization to a collapse. So to address that, and climate change mitigation requires that we generate energy without sort of emitting fossil fuels. So to address that, we have 2 individuals from the solar industry or green power industry. We have Mr. Nikhil Ved Prakash. He's a former electricity trader. He currently runs a green initiative helping Indian industry source green energy. He's someone who's he's an expert on the Electricity Act of 2009 and 2003, sorry, and is very familiar with the intricacies of how electricity demand and supply work in India. We also have Mr. Kashyap Dalal. He is a former telecom installation expert. He is currently director of Solar Tech, a company that installs solar projects across the country. Tech Solar also builds solar-powered tech. He brings to us his on-ground experience having worked in India's hinterland and urban space. So, do you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit about what Tech Solar does?
Tech Solar was founded about 9 years ago in India. Previous to that, we are the same directors. We were working out of Dubai, but the policies in India for solar became very conducive, so we shifted our operations to India because of the growing demand over here. We are into solar installations in the rural and urban areas. We started doing solar system installation for banking sector and microfinance branches for most part of the areas. We covered about, I'm not here to market ourselves, but we covered about 1,200 branches across India, and these are very important branches that we started with, microfinance branches, where lack of electricity meant lack of business, and this was directly affecting the farmers because these microfinance branches were giving insurance at a very subsidized rate to farmers. They were actually acting as bank deposits for all these farmers and a secure payment gateway at that point of time for the farmers. So I'll give you a small example. We did a small installation in Uduru, which is in about 2 hours drive from Chennai. And over there were about, the system was the 2 individuals were staying and operating the bank for 365 days. And there were a line of farmers who used to come there because about for 20 or 30 square kilometers, there was no way to deposit your money in any bank. So they used to keep their money at home or change it into gold, which is the traditional way of keeping. But after having this initiative, which was derived by Pranav Mukherjee, who wrote this, back in the day, we were collecting money from farmers because 50% of our income lies with them in terms of cash. It was a very good initiative. From there we moved out into agriculture space where we were powering solar for drip irrigation systems. This became extremely, you can say, good for the farmers because they had pumps but they didn't have electricity to run those pumps. So we moved into the agriculture space. We're still extremely active in that space in the rural areas, especially in the northeast, because that's where most of these big companies are not present or they are not interested in. The third space that we moved in about at that time was submersible pumps. So wherever there are boring wells, they have hand pumps. These hand pumps go up to 70 feet only. But the boring wells or the wells, they are at least 120 to 140 feet deep. So after 70 feet, because of the hand pumps restrictions, you cannot pump out water in the rural areas like we got experience in Sundarban, there is women who actually go and young, especially girls, who go and basically remove water for the houses from these wells. The problem is not that, because it's a traditional India where men go for farming and men go out to the city to work and women are running the house. The problem was these hand pumps are actually watering holes among the wilderness. The moment you start using the hand pump, it makes a noise and you have cattle and even wild animals coming there to drink water in the dry season. So this became dangerous for people. So from that we had a lot of experience. So then we started putting submersible pumps which were run again by solar, and we used to do like a kind of channel partnership understanding where we used to remotely help people through calls, now videos and FaceTime, how to operate the system and repair them, making the village sustainable. And in order to grow our business, we have moved into companies and factories where we are installing large-scale solar installations, and this is purely finance-based. And it is, when I say finance-based, is that people are installing solar systems to save money. They are not doing it for the environment. That is a challenge. But at least if in that way you are saving some, you are reducing some kind of carbon footprint in the planet, I think it's worth it.
Nikhil, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do within the industry, electricity market space?
So the Electricity Act of 2003 had a special feature in it which permitted large industrial and commercial consumers the right to purchase electricity directly from generators rather than just from the distribution companies they are embedded in. So state regulations, depending on each state, come out with regulations under which the consumers are allowed and under what methodology they are allowed to procure the power. So in certain states like Maharashtra, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, it's possible for an industrial consumer to procure either thermal power or renewable energy for his own needs, primarily for cost saving. So I work in that particular environment, that area of arranging for renewable or thermal energy for consumers who wish to buy cheaper electricity.
Is it still cheap though, that electricity?
So case to case, time to time, depending on regulatory charges and costs, these transactions become viable for some consumers, so they decide whether they'll buy renewable or they'll buy thermal. Or they'll even go for rooftop solar installations instead.
But based on the new tariffs, do you think has anything changed?
So what happens in the open access market is that these are shorter term markets, not always long term markets. So it's not that you're tendering or working out a tender price for it. It depends on the availability of generation at that time at those prices. So some renewable generation is available which is surplus from what they used to supply to the utilities. Once they exit those PPA, they're still available to supply power in the market. So you arrange for that kind of power. Or some consumers are willing to take the risk and take longer term 10-year, 15-year contracts to get down.
Okay, let's backtrack a little bit for people that possibly don't know. How does the electrical grid work in India?
So the electrical grid is a balance between consumption and generation. We as consumers are used to consuming power as we wish. We switch the light on when we need it, we switch it off when we don't want the electricity. Industries operate the same way. But your distribution company who takes care of your demand has to make a very accurate forecast of how much electricity he needs to procure for his consumers. And then he contracts and works with his suppliers and the grid manager to see how much electricity is required to be supplied from each generation source. While doing that, he also takes into account how much renewables is there in his system. Renewables are treated as a first must-run supplier. So he'll calculate his demand, he'll reduce what he expects will come from renewables, and the balance amount he will arrange for thermal power. Thermal generators will be asked to give their schedules today for their supply from midnight onwards till the end of the day. So everyone balances and gives exactly what power is being scheduled and required.
Does renewable energy sort of provide a stable sort of inflow of energy? I just read an article about Portugal where they said that Portugal provided more energy than, their renewable sources provided more energy than all of Portugal requires. Now, is all that energy used by the grid, or is that, what happens to that surplus energy, or is it surplus energy?
So I'll tell you, first of all, renewable energy started coming into play many years ago, but because of government incentives, especially in countries like Europe, where renewable energy became like a mandate, and you were getting tax incentives, people started putting, installing renewable systems, or basically using renewable energy systems in their everyday lives. So, example, if you go to Germany and you buy a solar lantern also for your house, you will get some credit for that. You will get some tax incentive. So that's a way to drive people to do this. At the end of the day, we all love the climate, everybody, but first thing, charity begins at home. You try and save your own self before you save others. That is the human mentality. So that's how people started using solar systems, even in a place where there's sun irradiation, so is there only for like 6 months a year. Now, in order to make these incentives, very you can say enticing, government came out with some subsidies which started eventually draining the economy. So it's basically like Spain and Italy. They actually started crumbling because government had to pay out more than what they actually could take in. And that's why now they are advertising that we have excessive power in place. So like you said about Portugal, they are looking at other countries to supply this power. But there are different, as Nikhil would know, there are different time of the day tariffs because there are different requirements. So if you see your electricity bill when you go back today, there are 4 zones and 4 different charges, A, B, C, D. So typically it is morning to afternoon, afternoon to evening, and then 6. I think the main one is 6:30 to about 12
So it's
o'clock.
8 o'clock to 10 o'clock,
8 o'clock to
and
10 o'clock.
morning peaks are between 9 and 12.
9 and 12. And then I think there's the evening time, which is from
10 o'clock to
10 o'clock to 6 in the morning. So there are different tariffs. Open access is a system where you generate electricity or solar through renewables in one place and supply to another, and you're using the grid as your infrastructure to supply that. When you talk about rooftop installation, you're actually putting solar system on your own roofs or your factories or your houses and using it for self-consumption. The way the system works is there are different policies. We have only 4 or 5 hours to generate electricity in solar energy. Then there's wind energy, we'll get to that in a second. So you are trying to mitigate your 24 hours requirement within that 4 hours. How do you do that? The excessive energy that you produce in that 4 hours, you send it back to the grid, and you use the grid as your credit bank in terms of electricity. At the end of the month, you get a bill which is said this export minus import. This is the amount of credits that I've generated, so I should get a reduced bill. That is the whole idea of this policy. Now, what is happening is, if you see the pattern of our in our calendar, the seasons. In summer we can generate high, in winter we can generate high, but we are using electricity for 4 months in monsoon. So government has given a system where you can bank these credits for 1 year, up to 1 year, for 12 months after installation. This is only for rooftops, but for open access, they have taken away the banking. So it's only month to month, and some states 2 months to month. So DISCOMs are not giving us the leverage, to bank these units. So you cannot have a larger system or larger infrastructure which is running on renewable energy, because you're investing more money, thinking my maximum utilization probably would be say in the month of July, but it's raining at that point of time. But why should I design a system in July? It's not going to work that much. I'm going to put excessive power, and I'm not going to utilize that. So it's a waste of money. Give a small example. The castor oil industry works only 6 months a year. It's huge in MP and some other states around it. So in this particular industry, they are highly electric consumption intensive. Sorry, thank you so much. Highly electric consuming industries when they want to do a production. But then 6 months of the year, they're not doing anything. The industry is typically shut. They're just paying the workers out of their pocket. So if they want to go to renewables, it's a deterrent with these kind of laws.
When you say bank electricity, do you mean that it's... So the electricity isn't actually stored, because does it survive on the grid?
It's not that. What happens is that renewables, when it was at a smaller scale, this is at utility level. When renewables were at a smaller scale, the distribution companies allowed you to freely inject power in the grid without scheduling. and they were absorbing the fluctuations of renewables coming, and so in the monsoon your wind power would suddenly shoot up, and suddenly drop from October, November onwards till February, you will get no generation. Solar power shoots up only during the day and then it drops. So all of these imbalances were being absorbed within the grid because there was a small percentage of it. But gradually what's been happening now, the Indian grid has also grown in terms of renewables. Today, in terms of capacity, the renewables are 86,000 megawatts. Total grid capacity is 3,65,000 megawatts. When you add large hydro to this, you get another 45,000 megawatts. So you're at 1,35,000 megawatts, which is approximately 30% of the grid. At this scale, you need to start getting into controlling and evaluating how the energy is coming into the grid and whether you can manage those fluctuations. If you were to rely completely on renewable energy, for example, to supply power to you at your home today, you on the power at 2 in the afternoon, but the wind generation starts in the night, so you're not going to get electricity. So thermal power provides kind of a backup, and renewables are allowed to flow freely, but they are asked to give forecasts, to give assessments of how much they may produce the next day, so that you plan how much thermal you will arrange for as a backup.
So
The
there's
Indian grid also has the facility to back down the thermal power plants to accommodate for more and more wind and solar getting integrated. Government came out with a plan to bring in about 1,75,000 megawatts of renewables into the grid, which may happen by 2022, may happen a little later. It appears that that much power can be absorbed by the grid. Currently, this much 33% capacity that we have is giving you somewhere around 19% of the actual electrical inflow into the grid, not more than that. So it's still absorbable. But as we grow our renewable systems, make them larger, you move the renewables because they are more concentrated in 6 or 7 states. You need to start broad basing it into the north. Wind power doesn't generate in the north. How do you get all that power there? You need to have grids which allow you to take that power over there. You need your transmission costs to be lower because your renewables will give you a capacity utilization factor of only 20%. The remaining time your transmission systems are not being utilized and there's a cost to that. All these things have to be factored in, and your grid has to evolve to take care of all of these issues. But it can be done.
so when
There's a new draft which has come out for the electricity grid, which its primary focus is the integration of renewables and the management of your thermal systems and storage systems and smart systems to better utilize the electricity input from renewables without backing down renewables.
so does one of you want to explain what a smart grid is?
Smart grid is exactly what he's saying, but it's happening. In the sense, it's already happening in the European countries, and we are replicating it here. It's like multiple. So the thermal plants are giving a certain area to a distribution company of electricity. So this year could be Tata, next year Adani or BEST in our case. So those are the distribution companies of electricity. They are the ones who actually collect the bills and make sure that the end consumer gets electricity. So that's so. Now smart grid is going to integrate thermal, wind, solar, bio, and all other kind of hydro. Though hydro is clean energy, but it's not extremely green energy because there's a lot of pollution there as well. So even for some point of time, we should eradicate that also after we are successful with coal at some point of time. The idea is to circumvent grids, distribution companies or thermal plants when there's no requirement or they are shut down or power cuts in those places, and understand in terms of consumer level and give them a report on how they should be using electricity in the most effective way. So if you just backtrack a bit, when I was saying different time of the day tariffs, I'll come back to this point. In a place called Iluru, not too far from Vijayawada, the time of day tariff is 13 rupees per unit. But at night, the same tariff goes to 3 rupees in the peak time, peak hours. But at night, post 12 o'clock, the price per unit goes to 3 rupees per unit. The reason why there is such a huge difference in the pricing is because there are so many industries over there, it's a jute belt, that they do not have enough power to distribute amongst all the factories. So they increase the prices to a certain level in the daytime, that many factories stay shut and they work only at night, and that 3 rupees plus the labor charges which are double at night plus the production will compensate for the lower tariffs that they're giving at that point of time. So these are certain things such that they have tried and they have been successful. In the case of smart grid, what will happen is a grid from Vijayawada will help Iluru, with the excess power required in the daytime, because in Vijayawada you won't need that kind of power. And the smart grids will also interact with the consumer, telling you what time and at what stage you should use your home appliances, like say washing machines or microwave ovens or some other, like irons for example. And we are not talking about refrigerator because you have to keep it on for 24 hours. So they'll tell you that if you wash your clothes in a washing machine for example, at between 6 to 8 in the evening, the grid rate will be the cheapest at that point of time, so you will save money. That's the kind of information that smart will give you at a consumer level. And at an industrial level, it will tell you you're better off doing your production as an off-taker of electricity. I say the highest amount of production between 6 to 7 in the morning. At that time of the day, the electricity rates are the lowest. So that is the smart grid which is going to be in effect. And then things of power cuts will become a thing of the past, because grids will help each other to integrate. And that's where the politics will come into play, and that is the situation that I've got a discount, I've taken Adani and I've taken Aurangabad, I'm Adani and I've taken Aurangabad as my sector for the next 5 years, and we've done a tender, and Tata will say I've taken another place nearby, and why should I give my grid to him at a lower rate, and those all issues will start happening which the government will have to circumvent.
So what is it that we need to get a smart grid? Why doesn't India have a smart grid?
It is inevitable, it will happen. But the problem is the policies that will follow.
So, see, a smart grid requires a normal grid has a connection of wires, transmission lines, generators, your grid managers who look and oversee and the operations that the system is working at optimal levels, grid frequency being managed. Then you have distribution companies and you have the distribution lines, substations. Then you have renewable energies, you have potential EV charging systems. Now, this is a grid. The smart grid is basically you're digitizing and putting communication devices and information gathering devices all across this whole system to sense what's happening over there. The use cases are innumerable, as is highlighted already. So, what you're saying then is that the grid will be able to analyze what is the best or most optimum way in which to operate. It could automate your billing systems, it could automate your consumption to some extent and say, okay, these are the times when a consumer's consumption should take place so that the grid is not stressed. Demand responses could also be controlled. You could also incentivize consumers because you have much more analytics about how their consumption is going on. You want to reduce their consumption at a certain time, you want to increase it at a certain time, so you can develop tariff systems based on their consumption patterns. So all this has a cost.
So when you said that the distributor has to assess or project how much electricity somebody is going to use at a specific time, how is that happening now? How is he going about projecting how much electricity this particular or one area is going to use?
They use trend data, they use certain information that they've gathered over 20-30 years that they've been in operation as to what happens with temperature when rain happens, so they know what kind of consumption patterns are there. Your electricity metering is on a monthly basis right now. They don't have a real-time visibility as to what's happening. The smart grid, that visibility comes immediately, in seconds. So distribution companies are utilizing it, it could utilize it potentially in that way.
And addressing the point you asked Nikhil earlier, how do you know what is the consumption pattern? So if you have a township, you know the amount of buildings, schools, colleges, industries coming in at point of time and how many people are going to use it. So if I'm constructing a building, I know there will be a 3-bedroom hall flat kitchen, and at least one room will have an air condition. Even if it's low housing, where there will be one television, 4 fans. So you understand what is the unit consumption, per flat in a day. And then you make an analysis. If they have 500 flats and the consumption is say 10 units, so it's going to be 5,000 at the end of the month, and that's how you create your substation, and that's how you apply. So when you go for low housing society registration and you have a 3-bedroom house and you say I'm going to put 2 air conditioners, they will reject your application. They're the issues, because they say you're using more units than you would be given afterwards you can put 5 air conditioners, doesn't matter. So the grid has a certain level of production that it can manage, and they have to grow as the cities or towns or rural areas grow.
So when you say discoms, do you mean distribution companies?
Electric distribution
Distribution companies,
So they're
okay.
basically the ones who are licensee distributors for a particular area or a zone, who are basically the guys who do the billing for electricity and maintain the grid or the transmission lines at that point of time. They are not necessarily the people who produce the electricity.
So, Mr. Dhara, in your talk you mentioned that obviously coal is more efficient than solar. And why is that?
It's like this, that solar energy, I didn't say that solar energy is less efficient than coal. There is a push, for example, to use electric vehicles, both in India and outside. Now, electric vehicles, there is a term called well-to-wheel efficiency in life cycle analysis. Electric vehicles are less efficient if basically they draw grid power. Essentially because the number of energy conversions that happen is much more. So what happens in an electric vehicle is that you are first digging the coal out, and then you are putting it into a power plant, and then you are generating electricity out of it, and you are transmitting it, and finally you are running motors in a car. In this entire process, you are losing energy in the form of waste heat at every stage. Like you are losing heat when you generate electricity. You are losing heat in the transmission from the power plant to the socket. And from the socket, what you're doing is you're taking the electricity and then you're converting it into chemical energy. And finally, you're taking the chemical energy out and converting it into mechanical energy, when you run a motor, basically. Okay. So every energy conversion means there is a loss, and in some places it's more, in some places it's a little less. And that's why you end up an electric vehicle which basically charges itself with grid power. Its well-to-wheel efficiency is of the order of about 18 to 20% or so. Whereas if you take a petrol engine, you're converting, or a diesel engine, you're converting directly from chemical energy into mechanical energy. And in that process, what happens is in a petrol engine, the well-to-wheel efficiency is of the order of about 25 to 27%, and a diesel is about 31% or thereabouts. If you were to charge the electric vehicle, basically using PV panels, then that makes a lot more sense, actually. But that is not the way it is being done today. We don't have that capacity to be able to do that. So essentially, in electric vehicles, what you're doing is the same thing as what you are doing with, for example, cities. You are transferring the point of pollution from the vehicle to the power plant. And in doing so, you are putting the people in and around the power plant at higher injury. So it's a good way for city people to say, oh, I'm being very green, but actually they are injuring the people around the power plant a lot more. This is, so there is a fallacy in this whole thing, that electric vehicles are in fact better than the fossil fueled prime movers.
Interesting.
I'd like to add three comments to what he said. First of all, what he's saying is absolutely right. That when you talk about electricity, what he's saying is, is absolutely right. In a place like India, our substations are old. We have to upgrade them. We have to put them on Internet of Technology, smart grids. And when these electric vehicles will hit the market, and since we are doing that, and we are right now the sole consultants for Mercedes India, for all the dealer distributors, the challenge that we find is we can put these fast chargers everywhere, but then again you're using the grid. Is the grid strong enough to give you the fast charge? Right? So if for example, a bus will take about 200 kilowatts of power. If there are 10,000 buses which are charging in a day in a city, the requirement of the grid will go up by 2 gigawatts. And if they all charge at least once a day, you will have immediate power cuts and the grid will fall. So in China, they have created a parallel grid for electric vehicle charging, which they are trying to run through renewables and other technology, and it is banned to charge cars at home. Eventually that will come here, or we'll have to create another grid. Because what he's saying is absolutely right, that we are harming the grid more.
So you said the grid would collapse. Why would the grid collapse?
It's like saying that in this room, if I put 500 people where there's a space of 50 people, what will happen? You'll all suffocate.
Right.
That's what exactly. There'll be too much requirement. There'll be too many off-takers. The production will be less. So they won't be able to distribute power.
No, so what we are talking about here is there's a sudden surge in or peak demand which can't be met because you have a set finite number of power plants operating and giving a constant source of power, and then suddenly you have a spike which can't be met by the generators. So that has to be planned and brought into a system somehow, that this is going to be the demand and therefore this is going to be the supply simultaneously. That's how electricity works. It has to be instantaneously both demand and supply. If you don't do that, system will just shut down.
So we'll have a power cut.
If you overdraw from grid, it will shut down.
Right. Interesting.
They are design trips, and sometimes what happens with these trips is they cascade, which means one plant after the other starts shutting down automatically.
So, 500 million people were without electricity a few years ago because of overall by the grid in India, the largest blackout.
It's happened in UP. In the northern grid, it's happened.
Because of overdraw from the system.
So, question to all of you: why can't we switch to renewable energies within a year? Like, why can't India sort of be in the headlines like Germany and Portugal? Why can't we switch to green within a year or 5 years?
I don't think it's an easy question to answer. There are issues which come down to technical aspects of incorporating renewables into the grid, for which the grid itself has to start having backup generation, battery transmission systems, all that have to be put into place. There's a cost that would entail, which I don't know if the government has money for. There are political issues also when you come down to the state level and you want to integrate renewables. Your grids at the state level already have a very large surplus of thermal power, for which fixed costs are already in place and they have to pay them irrespective of what power they take. If they add renewables in right now, they still have an obligation to pay fixed charges for whatever thermal capacity is they've already tied up. So they have to let go of that and then decide to invest in renewables. The condition of all the distribution companies is not that healthy, where you can raise finances to supply power to distribution companies. A lot of solar companies today are facing that problem as well. They go to banks to raise money against power purchase agreements with distribution companies, and the banks are telling them not unless your rates go higher or the payment securities are in place. You also have policy flip-flops where tenders have happened, rates have been provided, generators are ready to set up, and the states have backed out of doing those transactions for various reasons. So it's not, there are myriad of reasons why it can't happen immediately. At an individual level also, if you want to do that, right now electricity laws prohibit all categories of consumers from buying electricity. So it's large 1 megawatt and above industrial and commercial consumers who can do that, subject to it being cost effective. Rooftop solutions are available, but in cities, how do you set up rooftop projects which can cater to the entire consumption of housing society? There also the laws prevent distribution of electricity, so a society can't distribute electricity to the residential consumers. So all of this has to also change, all of this has to come about, then you can do it.
Do you think the government is enabling us moving towards renewables faster, or are they slowing us down?
I think come to that question, I'll just add to this question what we personally feel as a solution. I think it has to be financially and politically driven if you want to work everything on renewables. The thing is, in India, 60% or more is transmission line losses, what they say. But they are nothing but pilferage. Because people stealing electricity or they're not paying for electricity. Okay, so those are the losses which need to be addressed. So any thermal plant company, any distribution company that goes for a contract is perpetually in the red. So you have a government distribution company and then you have a private distribution company. In a city like Ahmedabad, there is GVDCL, there is Gujarat Electricity Discom, and there is Adani and Torrent Power. in the same city, in one area, the price per unit will be about 6 rupees or 7 rupees per unit. But if you go to the privatized side of the DISCOM, where there's foreign power, it's about 11 to 12 rupees. There's a difference of 4 to 5 rupees because the government is giving a subsidy to its own department of the 4 to 5 rupees. It's not that Torrent Power charging you more. It's just that they're giving the 4-5 rupees to their own distribution company as a subsidy, so to promote them. So this is one issue. The second issue is, the policy that we have should be a policy that is financially friendly for the off-taker or the end consumer as well as the industrialist. For example, in UK they have something called the green tax or green levy. What happens is that is, like you said, if you set up solar plants or wind farms, you are giving the energy to the grid or the substations through the DISCOM, and the DISCOMs are perpetually in the red because of these transmission line losses or whatever reasons there are. At that point of time, your electricity is going for waste. They are not, or they are distributing this power not paying you. So if they don't pay you, what happened to Suzlon or what happened to Tamil Nadu, where they have the highest amount of wind farms because only certain pockets where you can have wind, they are not got their payments for 3 to 4 months in the first year of installation was 6 years ago, which was okay with them. Now they have not received their payments for about 8 to 12 months. I think for 8 to 12 months, and that also now they don't know when they're going to get the next payment. So if you are using bank support, or if you are basically taking debt from the bank to invest in solar farms, okay, your return of investment will go for a toss. So that's a huge deterrent to enter such a renewable energy industry. We should follow examples, from the West. For example, the West, like for example in Germany, if you are producing power, like we have over here the rooftop system, which is called the net metering policy, where you take credit at the end of the month for whatever you export and you pay the net bill. In certain states, we have something called gross metering, where whatever you produce, you give back to the grid, and they give you a lower rate of price at that point of time. In Germany, they also have this kind of system of gross metering, that whatever you produce in your house, you are helping the country, you are helping us to reduce our whole
Reliance.
and that's how it should be seen, I personally feel. So when somebody is consuming electricity, the preference should be given to the small producers, the rooftop guys, to draw in power, not the thermal plants. That's what Germany has done, but here it's not like that. Right? If you want people to encourage and put more rooftop solar plants or put it in their farms and bring it back to the grid, government should give them some incentive where they don't make a loss of investment. Like in UK, they have these green levies for the reason that people have invested in wind farms and solar farms at large scale, megawatt scale, and they're losing power because at that point of time power is not required. They are getting paid from this green tax for the loss that they have made. So these are certain incentives that government needs to do. It's all policy driven. The technology is out there.
Well, why are
But
we
it can't be 100% renewable at this point of stage.
why are we favoring thermal though? I mean, you said we've built in capacities. Can you expand on that?
That's how it used to be, and that's how the grids have grown across all countries. It's just that now that realization has set in that you need to start greening your grids more. It's been only a few years since it's actually being implemented. There are very few countries which have actually reached the levels. India is leading it, and it's only at about 19 or 20%. It's just traditionally been that way. It's a more stable system because thermal power, it's predictable. As much as you want, you will get it. So you can plan and schedule it much more easily. Develop that. Now you're trying to green it.
But why is renewable not as easy to schedule as thermal?
Well, look at it differently. I mean, solar, it's more predictable, but your power comes only for a few hours of the day, from maybe 9 in the morning to 5:36 in the evening. Wind energy is more unpredictable. It flows in the monsoons. You can expect a larger volume of power, but it can happen at any point in time. You don't have any control on the wind. Your consumers need power at a certain point in time. They switch on their light at that point in time. If the wind is not blowing, there is no electricity coming from the light. So you need something to normalize all of that as well. So storage has been suggested as one of those things, but that's a very expensive solution right now. Grid itself has to manage within what it has without using storage, and they're saying they can to some extent do that. Currently they're saying with the 1.5% curtailment of thermal power further, they can manage the 175 gigawatts of renewables that will come into the Indian system. They'll manage, they won't need storage.
And is thermal power plants, is it as simple as switching them off and switching them on when you need them, or?
It's a good question, but no, it's not very difficult.
Not quite, because there is a startup problem where emissions increase when you start up a thermal power plant. It takes a while to start up a thermal power plant. The easiest to actually operate are the hydro plants, because you just allow the water to flow and then you start generating. So that's how it works. And with thermal power plants, there's also a question of being able to carry coal. And oftentimes nowadays, you see, despite India being one of the top 5 countries in terms of coal reserves, we are importing anything like 12 to 20% of our coal right now. Because a lot of the coal seams are basically in areas which are thickly forested. So you can't, without disturbing the forest, you can't. You see, there are 2 things you have to do to get to the new coal seams. One is you have to displace the forest, and the other is you have to displace the Adivasi. You displace the forest and the environmentalist is going to yell, and that's what's happened, and you displace the Adivasi, the human rights people are going to yell. So it's not that easy. So then you go to Australia, and the Australian government wants to sell you coal, but the people are yelling. There are several other issues which I think we need to also take on board. Since you were talking about NCA analysis earlier, we did an NCA analysis for solar power in India some time back, and what we found was that essentially a lot of the panels that we are buying are basically from, again, carbon grid intensive countries like China, which is not the best way to do it. Actually, the best way to do it is to actually buy solar panels, if they're available, from countries which are not carbon intensive grids, for example Norway, and then use it in places where you have high solar insolation, which means where you have a lot of sun basically. Okay, so PV panels made in Norway being used in India is the best way to do it, because your what is called the payback time of carbon dioxide is then low.
Because Norway is green.
Whereas if you actually used a solar panel made in India or China and used it in Norway, it just doesn't make sense at all, because the payback time then goes into a couple of 100 years. Now the payback time in India, carbon dioxide payback time in India, that means basically when you look at what is the carbon dioxide that was used to make the solar panel, install it, and transport it and so on and so forth, versus the carbon dioxide that is saved by replacing fossil fuel. In India, it's more than 8 years, which again is not a very good figure. The payback time should be of the order of about 2 to 4 years or thereabouts. So, since we are using panels from, again, a grid-intensive country, China, to a large extent, that is, we're getting panels from Malaysia and so on and so forth, there are environmental problems with this whole thing. India, of course, has the advantage of having a lot of sunlight in most of the places. But talking about Germany, I don't think Germany is the best example for us to emulate. Actually, it's Cuba is the best example to emulate, because it's a country which actually went through the pain of fossil fuels being cut off. And that's what happened to Cuba when the Soviet Union collapsed. Its entire oil source went. And so they were forced to learn how to do with less energy. They got rid of their fertilizers, first thing. Their entire transport system was completely revamped. And in fact, there were government, guides, you call them what you want, who could stop any government car and say, okay, you have only 2 people in the car. Now, here are 3 people standing on the road. Pick them up and drop them there.
Ola pool.
Yeah. And they got into things like urban farming. They used retired people to do urban farming and saved, in fact, a lot of energy in that whole process. So, if you look at, for example, the way they did it, India needs to emulate a country like Cuba and how they overcame some of their energy problems. And even today, when you look at the way that they are dealing with it, it's much closer to what we can do as compared to Germany. Now, Germany, for example, Enets and companies like that have backed, in fact, their entire renewable generation capacity with fossil fuels. In the process, in fact, if you look at the emissions of Germany, they're higher than Britain. The per capita emissions of Germany is something of the order of about 8.4, 8.5 ton per capita, whereas Britain is 5.5 or something of that sort. I'm not comparing it with France, which has a very high nuclear generation capacity, or with Norway, which has a high hydro generation capacity. So the other problem with rooftops in a country like India is a lot of the rooftops that have been done in Germany have been done by cooperative societies, which are money. Where do we have those kind of societies in India which have the money to do rooftops in India? So there are these, other than all the things that the other panel members have said, there are these additional problems that we need to look at. The problem with, see, so far we've been talking only about PV, but actually renewables is not just PV. When you talk about solar energy, it's actually in 3 technologies, and that's what is often missed out. That, the CSP technologies, that is concentrated solar power, where you convert solar energy directly to heat and use it particularly for in large kitchens, has a lot of potential in India, particularly where there are mass kitchens. And it's been done. For example, Tirupati Devasthanam has a very large CSP kitchen. And similarly, some gurdwaras and so on have installed these things. Actually, the third way in which solar power can be used is via basically biomass. So you can harvest biomass and then briquette it and then use it in Stirling engines and things of this sort, which in fact in India has, or even globally, not been explored sufficiently. And that is a route that we need to explore in this country, which is why I was earlier talking about biomass being a better fuel energy source for countries like India and Sri Lanka and so on and so forth, because it's a cheap way of doing things. Of course, there is a problem, which is basically when our forests are already under stress, and basically, we should avoid using plantations on farmlands and things of the sort.
Earlier on in your talk, you said that using solar panels would eventually lead also to global warming. Why did you say that?
Yes, see, there is a certain amount of energy that comes into the earth. Now, as long as we tap into that, basically we will not be causing global warming, because that's already an energy source that is taken care of in terms of the energy balance of the earth. But supposing we got rid of fossil fuels, which anyway are going out the window shortly, and we were able to, which I don't think we can, able to continuously grow PV capacity, including putting it in the Sahara or etc., etc. What would then happen basically is that there would be an additional absorption of solar insulation that would come in, because basically solar panels are dark in color, and once they're dark in color, they would absorb more and reflect less. You would change the what is called reflectivity, or in technical terms it's called albedo.
Albedo, yeah.
Right. Now, if you change the albedo, then what you're doing is actually changing the energy balance of the earth. This is going to happen about, let's say, 200-300 years.
Wouldn't we need like a significant amount of solar panels for that?
That is what the computations say. There have been research papers written on this. It would change it, but it would happen. The current energy growth rate, global energy growth rate, is about 2.3% per annum. If this were to continue with PV panels, about 300 years down, the waste heat of the extra energy that is absorbed by the earth would then cause sufficient waste heat to cause global warming.
So are you referring to the infrared light that the solar panels would not absorb?
No,
or
the incoming solar radiation would be absorbed.
in the panels, but then they're transforming it to something else and using it.
There, no, he's saying it's there's a reflective index. When the sun is, rays come into the atmosphere, it becomes photons and thermal, so it's heat and light. But when it reflects back, it goes back to the atmosphere, you're keeping the heat and going back the light, so then it causes a greenhouse effect.
Ah, fair enough. Interesting.
So unlimited growth of energy. See, because recently I was, in a lecture being given by Tim Flannery, who came to Hyderabad, and he said, PV can grow forever and there'll be so much energy. He was talking like what many people started talking soon after nuclear energy was used for commercial purpose. Right, it'll be too cheap to meter and things of this sort. So basically I said, listen, this is what's going to happen. You'll end up, if you think that you can grow with PV at the same current rate of 2.3% and you do it for 200-300 years, you will actually end up causing a global warming problem. Now, he didn't understand this whole point. But this point has been actually discussed in research papers and things of the sort already.
Right.
And I've had opportunity to discuss this with climate scientists and they do agree that this will happen. So unlimited growth of energy is not possible.
So what was the classic example, I think in the 1860s, when there were horses all around New York and everybody used to transport themselves, from one place were using horses. There was an issue with horse dung, and it was everywhere. It was coming everybody's feet. So when Ford came out with the first, or they first were electric cars actually, and then Ford came with the consumption cars, they said, oh, that's the answer to our green energy or cleaner way for transport. Because there are horse dungs everywhere. And so that they predicted if it goes on for the next 10 years, they'll have horse dung, to 30-40 feet, and there won't be enough place to clean it. I mean, how much water can you use for the crops? So that kind of car was the answer. Right now, it was solar, but it has to evolve. Having said that, we had tried with biogas and bioenergy with plants in the past like Jetopa and Inchu, which you get, and I think algae is the best answer because if you have certain strands of algae which multiply extremely fast, if you try them, you get the algae oil, and that can be used through a genset again to power your houses, and it's got, I think, zero emissions. If possible, you can do that. We tried that. Right now.
Isn't it a Mexican company that's
There are a lot
doing?
of companies doing it now, but I don't know, for some reason it's not being promoted or it's not being too successful over here.
Interesting.
You don't hear about it.
Okay, last question. But before I get to the last question, I just want to probe coal a little more. When you said you can't ramp it up, it takes a while to turn on and a while to turn off. Why? What do you mean by that? Just for the layperson to understand why I can't switch on and switch off
You gotta
coal.
fire up a boiler.
Right.
You're firing up a boiler is not like putting on a switch.
But why can't I just disconnect it from the grid?
It's
Right.
like, supposing you started boiling water. Is it going to boil instantly?
No.
It's like,
And so it's
a
going to
boiler.
take a while to
It's
cool
a boiler.
down as well.
Yeah.
But why can't I just disconnect it while it's cooling down?
So you have to run a steam.
You can. But you'd be ending up
Wasting,
using fuel to
still burning coal.
So you're wasting
burn-
energy.
Yeah.
There is also an issue of ramping down to a certain extent because of the efficiencies of usage of the plant, and I suppose even some more pollution that is caused by using them at inefficient levels.
Firing up causes what are called spikes. Firing up boilers always causes spikes in sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide.
So we want to keep the plant running at a certain rate. We have done some factories where they're using 5 to 8 megawatts. These are huge factories, where they're running on thermal plants. If they buy electricity that's 8 or 9 rupees. If they go for solar, it is a little cheaper. But little cheaper means 4 or 5 rupees. But the solar plants cost them 3 rupees, 3.5 rupees to run. So the first preference, obviously, for such huge plants will be to run on thermal. And like so I was saying, exactly, it's a huge cost to fire it up, but not good for the environment also, and not good for the factory owners also. It takes a lot of effort.
Okay, I have a few more questions. Sorry, I just remembered them. Electricity, do we pay the same rates in comparison to the rest of the world? How much does Germany pay, roughly, and how much do we pay California, for instance?
Germany is around, I think, 20 rupees odd.
6 cents is the figure that I remember. We're not paying 6 cents. Less than that.
At 6 rupees or 7 rupees a
6
unit
cents a
at the
kilowatt.
It's not go that far. Is that in Sri Lanka, like in India, the residential we pay less than the commercial. In Sri Lanka, it's the other way around. So in Sri Lanka rupees, I think the exchange rate is about 2.32. So for Sri Lankan, they are paying 45 rupees per unit. So that is 22 Indian rupees, whereas we are paying like 8-9 rupees on the higher level. And if you go to places like Silvassa, Chandigarh, there's 4 or 5 rupees. Whereas the industries also, they are paying the same rate as our residential. So everywhere, and obviously it's an island country, so resources are limited. But I'm just saying, our electricity is one of the cheapest in the world. But still, it's expensive for our economy. Because we're
Also-
importing, sorry,
No, please.
23 billion, I think we are putting $23 billion a year of coal. I think we imported in 2019, that is 238 metric tons. Compared to, it's a 16% rise in last year, or 18% rise. So we need more and more energy.
Who are our biggest thermal power generators in the country?
20%.
Sorry?
80%.
Straight away,
80%.
80%.
NTPC, okay. And electrical suppliers in the country?
And state utilities are your suppliers, your distribution companies are your largest suppliers. Maharashtra, I think, is the largest state right now. Their peak demand is around 20,000 odd megawatts of power at some points in the year.
Is the government the largest supplier or the private entities largest suppliers?
On par.
Yeah. Private sector has been growing now because they've been supplying to state utilities through power purchase agreement. So that has been growing. But NTPC also and centralized plants.
They're better at curtailing all this pilferage. So small,
Small footnote to what he said. You see, Sri Lanka's power, they don't have fossil fuels at all. Everything is imported. Their first coal-based plant is just about coming up now, and I think Hambantota. All their generation so far has been with diesel generator sets. It's obviously more expensive than coal. Now, the reason why India went in for coal on such a large scale is basically it was felt that India has a lot of coal reserves, so use it. That's why it went in for coal. There was a point in time in the late 60s, early 70s when it started planning a string of fertilizer plants based on coal, which is a very dirty and a very more expensive way of doing it rather than using gas or naphtha. So if you look at the old, there are 2 fertilizer plants which now I think have shut down, one in Ramagundam and one in Paradip, which were coal-based fertilizer plants, making urea. Because we felt that, or rather the government then felt that, okay, we have a lot of coal, so why should we import?
So the life cycle emissions of coal, would that take into account deforestation as well?
It's not life cycle analysis that's done, but basically
Yeah.
environmental analysis. Answer is a big capital NO. And that's what I've been doing. I mean, basically critiquing all the impact assessment reports and risk analysis reports and so on and so forth. That the entire injury to human society and to forests and to the crops and so on is just not taken into account at all. At all. Either in the costing or in the impact assessment.
Okay, genuinely the last question now. How soon do you think we are from like 100% renewable, renewably sourced energy supply in India?
Maybe 30 years, I think. It's far away. 30
You're
years.
saying in terms of, you're looking at the government or people taking
The country having, and why do you think that?
Just, 2 small case studies to tell you. I used to work with Global Telecom, which had 35,000 towers. They were spread all around rural areas and certain urban areas. So I was in charge of energy management, and I was glad that I came and I heard his talk, which was very interesting. 80% of energy management or renewable energy or converting this was administration. People were working very ineffectively, and so most of the biggest issue we had was towers which are in rural areas along the highways or in the villages, which were running on gensets for 16 hours, 20 hours, 24 hours. So we had put out some tenders, and then we had one Saudi Arabian company coming in, and they replaced, I think, gensets with 500 towers with solar panels instead of gensets. And what happened? 15 days later, all the panels were broken because you're disturbing a buying of a society which is used to making money from the pilferage. It is actually the genset's not running for 16 hours; it's running for only 4 hours. It's powering the battery that is radiating the tower with energy. But the problem is that from the project manager of the company to the villager to the panchayat head to the local guards, all of these guys are involved in this story. They all are involved. They don't want to change. So you cannot disturb the bind overnight. It has to be a gradual process. You drop it from. That's the reason why I was called. And I said, listen, we need a solution for that. I said, yes. What we need to do is reduce it from 24 hours to 20 hours. The next year again another 16 hours. Slowly get them used to not making money from this source of income. Then I'll give another story.
They were supplying diesel to the tower.
All towers have diesel generators as a backup. If you lose electricity in a city like Bombay where you've never seen any power cuts or you rarely see any power cuts, then every tower has 4 hours of battery backup minimum. Okay, so for up to 4 hours your phones and all, your mobiles will work. After that, you'll have issues with even the reception because we don't have gensets as a backup here. But everywhere apart from Bombay, and now it's coming in most of the parts of the country, I think 10-15% of the country is already there where we don't, like major cities like Ahmedabad, Chennai, they don't have power cuts anymore. But we do have power cuts in other parts of the cities, and if you go to Pune also, you have power cuts over there. Another case study, we were doing solar for some NGOs, we were doing some workshops also to empower local women to, put up, solar lanterns we can sell. So I was there on the weekend and I was seeing that we had kept 2 Syntex tanks where the villagers used to come. And I'm saying villagers, I'm not talking Adivasis, I'm talking guys on scooters and bikes coming with, huge bucket, containers, empty containers of water and coming into the NGO and filling out water. So I asked them, what is the problem? Why are all these guys coming here? So we kept a separate tank for these guys, and this is not too far away. This is just about 5 kilometers away from Dombivli, where it's in the outskirts of the city between Taloja and Nhava Sheva. So they have schools and everything over there. But all these guys are coming, and you're talking about all these guys who have electricity. They have scooters at their house. They've got dish TV. They've got television. They have a car. Some of these guys, but they're sparsely. Located in the houses are sparsely located. But they are not having running water. They have a line of water running, the pipeline which government has invested, but they are still coming to the ashram or ordering tankers for water. So then I went and met the local MLA with some other guys and helpers, and they said, so whatever you're trying, it's not going to work out. I said, why? See, we built a reservoir overhead that can supply water to the entire village or whatever that district, your small area that you call. But it will never happen. We've done the inauguration. I said, why? He said, the moment we start the water, this area will come under the municipality and these guys will start have to pay tax, and they don't want to pay tax. So they won't vote for the MLAs. So the MLAs have to go with what these guys say. So it is our mentality that needs to change. We need to change also. That is, I think, a major cause. It starts with us. As you can say, government and all that.
All right.
This is just one of the examples. You might have a better outlook.
How far do you think we are from going renewable for the time being?
There is a corollary to the question. At what level of consumption?
The current level of
I
consumption.
think we should say that.
Because you have a plan for
We
your
can't
grades
do it.
also to expand.
Pan, yeah.
Our consumption is also going to increase. To what extent do you want?
We can't do it.
We can't do it. Only India can't do it, or just
See, it's there are other resources that are required, and not just PV panels. We require land. In order, there are 2 places where you can put up. If you're talking of just PV, first of all, let's talk about wind. Wind in this country, first of all, wind speeds in all tropical countries are low. They're half of what they are in temperate zone countries. Okay. So if wind speeds, for example, this is why Delhi has this whole pollution problem, besides the inversions and other things. Part of the problem is because the average wind speed in Delhi, the yearly average wind speed is something like 2 to 3 meters per second. London is 6. So first of all, there are only half a dozen states which have sufficient, some amount of wind power, mainly in the south and a little bit in Gujarat and a little bit in Maharashtra. That's it right now, based on the current surveys that have been done. Now future surveys may show that maybe there's a little more somewhere else. Now in all renewables, there is a term called deployability. It's not your theoretical capacity that matters. Now you might have high wind power on top of Nanda Devi, but can you put a generator there? You can't. So actually the amount of deployable wind power that there is globally will cater to only approximately 5% of the total current consumption of energy. So in India it's even worse in a sense, because there are very few. You can't do it in Madhya Pradesh, you can't do it in Assam, you can't do it in UP. They don't have wind power sufficient to generate wind. So wind is not a solution. There are friends of ours who've actually knocked up tidal, machines which will generate usually from tidal. In fact, I have a slide here in this itself on that. Even that is low, and that is basically local. You can't do very much about those things. So what else do we have? We don't have much geothermal power. So you're left with basically solar. Now, alright, if you want to generate electricity with solar, then you go in for PV. Now, as far as PV goes, you can use, basically monosilicon and polysilicon PV panels. You can't really use thin films for too long, because the cadmium and tellurium that is used in thin film PV panels, though it's a very small percentage that is made out of thin films. Thin films have certain advantages over these silica panels. Once the cadmium and tellurium go into short supply, that's out. Now, people have been experimenting with what are called polymer-based PV panels and so on. But once oil goes out, your polymer-based PV panels, unless you make those polymers out of photosynthetic materials, that's out. You're left with, this. Now, how much land do you require? Because the two places you can do is rooftop and the other is land. There's an enormous amount of land that's required. Now, I forget the figure right now. I have the figure somewhere with me. But as I remember, you would require something like about a third of India's land mass or something of that order. A massive amount of land would be required to power India even at the current level of per capita consumption of energy. Where is that land going to come from? Is the question. So it's not just a question of PV panels and how many PV panels can we put. There are other resources.
PV panels with increased efficiency? Because right now they're all 45% best.
Oh, no, not at all.
20%.
20%.
Oh.
See, even in the lab, you're not able to get that kind of efficiency. So I don't know if I'm not sufficiently well read on PV efficiency. Whatever I have readings I've done on it, I don't think you can get it up to that point. So there is a limit to how much of PV you can do. So like I said, my own solution for all this is actually to explore the biomass route a lot more than what we have done so far, because it has a lot more potential.
Over your consumption. Traditionally, if you go to Marine Drive, I don't know now what is the number of floors, but if you go to old cities, the maximum amount of floors in a building will be 4, because after that it's a mandate to have a lift. In Europe it is 3 floors. If you go on the 4th floor, you have to have a lift. So if you don't want to have a lift, you make buildings, sparse and wide, but you only need 4 floors. I'm just giving an example. So you're reducing so much electricity, because it's the highest, I think consumption of electricity in a building comes from the lifts.
There are some innovative solutions that we have done. For example, put PV panels on top of canals. It serves two purposes. I mean, you're saving on land space, at the same time you're reducing evaporation from canals. But there is a
Limit to that.
what you can do.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having us.
I think okay. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, you got your answer. Anyone? No. Okay. I think that's us. Thank you.